Hello, everybody. This is Georgianne Hughes, and this is The Bite Show. And we're really blessed to have Peter Levenda with us. He is a researcher and an author of some fine books. We have been doing a series on sinister forces. And tonight we're going to change, and we're going to do what will begin a new series on Ratline. And Peter, tell them how they can get a copy of Ratline.
Sure. Barnes & Noble is carrying it in most of their stores, but you can also get it, of course, online at Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com, all the usual places.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, why was Argentina considered not safe enough?
Okay, we'll have to backpedal a little bit.
Okay.
Not safe enough for whom? The Argentina was considered a pretty safe destination for Nazis in general.
Yeah.
And that's because the government there, especially under Juan Perón, was very pro-Nazi, pro-fascist. Basically, Juan Perón had admired Mussolini's fascists for a long time. There was a lot of money pouring into Argentina from the SS just before the end of the war, and then, of course, long after the end of the war, paying people off and making sure that Argentina would be a safe destination. Also, Juan Perón's brand of Catholicism was a blend of Catholicism and anti-communism, which made it also an ideal location for Nazis. So you had a huge influx of war criminals to Argentina specifically, but then to other countries in the region, Bolivia, Paraguay, Chile, Brazil, at the end of the war. People were basically well disposed towards the ideals of Nazism for the most part. They saw the Nazis as being anti-American, of course, and many of the people in Latin America shared those sentiments because they had dealt with American colonial type of activities for a long time. Starting with the Monroe Doctrine, in which, basically North America said South America was off limits to everybody else. So there was a kind of anti-American sentiment and a pro-fascist sentiment, and the idea that Catholicism could be the bulwark against communism. So all of this made Argentina a very attractive place for Nazis who were now escaping the fall of the Third Reich. However, if you were a very prominent Nazi, if you were one of the most wanted war criminals in the world, Argentina might not have been a safe place for you to go to, because a lower level Nazi might have traded the information for their own safety, or they may have traded it for money, or they may have tried to cut a deal with American intelligence or British intelligence or even Soviet intelligence. So in some cases you might have found yourself in a bit of a sticky wicket when it came to Argentina, because it was a two-edged sword. For the most part, the regime was very friendly towards you, and the regime would protect you in as far as they could. But you had to be kind of suspicious of some of your fellow Nazis and some of your fellow war criminals. Were they part of the comrade, setup or not? Were they SS? The SS was branded as a criminal organization by the Allies. So if you belonged to the SS, you were automatically a war criminal. So the SS tended to stick together. But what if you were not SS, but you were still a war criminal? Could you count on the SS to protect you? Or was there going to be some kind of quid pro quo there, which you have to buy your freedom or somehow ransom it? So I think there was a complicated situation, and we tend to look at the Nazi underground as monolithic, and it wasn't. There were personalities. There was Otto Skorzeny. There was Hans Rudel. There were people who were financing this, and they were not a charitable organization, shall we say. They were people who, needed favors in return quite often. So I think it was a complicated place. And I think that if someone as high profile as, let's say, Adolf Hitler were to try to escape to Argentina, would he have been able to stay there for any length of time? Could he rely on the people around him, some of whom had felt betrayed by Hitler for various reasons, or felt betrayed by the Third Reich in general? Maybe somebody would have traded in, Hitler's identity or Hitler's whereabouts for some, for a lot of money or for some protection by one of the Allied governments or whatever. It's possible, especially if you were lower level and you were looking at maybe a possible prison term, or you were broke and the other Nazis were not coming forward and helping you out. Maybe you were bitter. So I think that someone like Hitler would have been nervous after a while and not feel that he was really being protected, to the best that he could.
Well, there's a skull that the Russians claim is Hitler. How does that happen?
Well, see, that's a bit of a problem for historians, because the story of the Hitler skull, its provenance is very murky, because this whole thing was in the hands of Russian intelligence. It started off with a group called SMERSH, which was a Soviet counterintelligence operation within the NKVD, which later became the KGB. SMERSH is an acronym. It means Death to Spies. So it was one of the Stalin era, anti-intelligence, counterintelligence operations, and they were the first on the scene in Berlin at the fall of Berlin. The Russians, of course, are the ones who entered Berlin. The other allies came in a bit later. So the Soviets were the first. So they were there at the bunker, and they basically laid claim to whatever they found there. And there's a very strange, complicated, convoluted story of how the Soviets came across or came into possession of Hitler's body, as well as Eva Braun's body and the bodies of the Goebbels family, and so on and so forth. The whole story changes constantly between one Russian dossier and the next, and we really don't know the truth behind any of this. The spies, the Russian spies, were telling one story to Stalin, and Stalin wasn't buying it, and he told them to go back there and find out. And people were deathly afraid of Stalin. Stalin could order your execution with the blink of an eye, as he did. Thousands of people purged under Stalin, hundreds of thousands. So, people were very frightened. So they would tell Stalin whatever Stalin wanted to hear, basically, as long as they could give some evidence to prove it. So they came across some bodies in Berlin, and the story of how they came across it is also very murky. You had a Nazi, an SS officer who was captured by the Soviets, and he was forced to tell them where Hitler's body was, and he couldn't find it. And then later on, they got other information as to where the bodies might be, and suddenly, miraculously, he finds them in the same place the Soviets say they're supposed to be. The whole thing was stupid. Anyway, so they dig up these two bodies of Hitler and Eva, supposedly, and they perform autopsies. Battlefield autopsies. This was not, a CSI type autopsy we're doing here. This is, a bunch of Soviet doctors with, a hammer and a saw and a couple of pairs of scissors or something, and they're trying to perform an autopsy on two bodies that had been partially burned. And they found initially one body that was the dead ringer for Hitler, and it turned out it wasn't Hitler. It was one of Hitler's doubles. They found a guy called Gustav Weber, who was a Hitler double, who was living peacefully somewhere. They found another double, in a grave, and they thought it was Hitler. The whole thing was a mess. So they finally find this one body, and it's partially burned, because the idea was the bodies of Hitler and Eva were cremated by the SS in front of the bunker in the Reichschancellery garden. And they poured petrol, they poured gasoline over the bodies, lit it, and the bodies were partially burned. So they were burned beyond recognition facially. There was no way of telling from the faces of these two individuals who they were. So they had to rely upon dental records. Now that's another funny story, because there were no dental records. The dental records had basically been destroyed. So they found a dentist, or they found a dental assistant, actually. and the dental assistant suddenly draws the dental records of both Hitler and Eva Braun perfectly from memory, right?
Oh.
I mean, it's an impossible task, right? But they're in Soviet captivity, so they draw dental records which match precisely the dentures that are found in each of these two bodies, in Hitler's and in Eva Braun's body. So now we have invented dentures, a dental record, matching found dentures. The problem with the dentures is that they didn't fit in the mouths of these corpses.
Oh.
They were sort of shoved in there kind of loosely.
Yeah.
Number one. Second problem is the dentist who made these dentures made two sets of each. So one set is accounted for in the skulls of these two bodies found in the bunker, in the grave outside the bunker. The other two dentures, we don't know where they are. So there's a whole bunch of mysteries concerning this. And then there's the mystery, of course, about the suicide, but that's another story. So you asked about the skull, well, evidently that was the skull. Evidently that skull was the Hitler skull they found outside of the Berlin bunker. And that skull has been preserved in a box at KGB archives since the end of the war until a couple of years ago when an American archaeologist, Nick Bellantoni from the state of Connecticut, went over to Moscow to test the skull to see if it's really Hitler's skull. Well, he was able to bring a piece of it back. In the first place, he just examined the skull, and the skull was not that of a man of Hitler's age. You can tell the age of a body from the skull, the way the pieces of the skull fuse together.
Yes.
And his first reaction was, this is the skull of a much younger person.
Oh.
But then he took a piece of it back, and had it tested. And it turns out that it's the skull of a female.
Oh.
And it's the skull of a female, I believe, in her 30s. And it was not Eva Braun. Obviously, it was not Hitler. So the skull the Soviets had been claiming all this time was Hitler's skull could not possibly be Hitler's skull. And so now we're left with this problem that there is no forensic evidence anywhere to prove that Hitler actually died. I mean, there's no body.
Oh.
There's no forensic evidence. There's nothing. So it's a problem. You know, it's a real problem, and we're back to square one. Did Hitler die in the bunker? Did he die in 1945? Was it suicide? If he did die, was it murder? What happened? So that's how I got involved in the story, was suddenly realizing that, you know, the information coming back to me challenged everything that I had been led to believe all my life. So I went back and said, okay, let's start with a clean slate. Let's examine the evidence. Let's look at the eyewitness testimony, because that's all we have.
Yeah.
And try to piece the story together from there.
Wow. Well, in this Ratline, what is the connection between the Catholic Church and the Ratline?
Well, that's a long story. It goes back to the war itself. The church was between a rock and a hard place. The church feared the spread of communism much more than they feared the spread of fascism or Nazism. There wasn't anything inherently anti-Catholic in fascism or Nazism per se. The Nazis were going to create a pagan empire. I mean, that was their ultimate goal, was to get rid of the church entirely. They saw the church as a kind of development of Judaism, and of course they repudiated Judaism entirely, and they repudiated the Catholic Church's take on all of that entirely as well.
I
Hitler
think that the Nazis even today have that idea.
Of course, sure. I mean, the Christian identity movement in the United States is a small movement, but it's a racist Aryan movement. Is also rewriting the Bible. They want to portray Jesus as an Aryan. They're trying to say that Jesus was not Jewish.
Yeah.
Stories is he's the illegitimate son of a Roman soldier, which makes him, Aryan. Other stories have that the Jews invented the story of Jesus, who was actually an Aryan, and they try to make, which is all kinds of stories like that. But the German movement that still exists, the neo-Nazi movement, is pagan, is oriented towards paganism. Christianity is not really on the agenda. They want to go back to the worship of the Nordic gods, Thor and Wotan, and all of that, and go back to those days, to what they see as their true racial heritage. So they want to dump all of the Abrahamic religions, all of the monotheistic religions that came out of Judaism, including Islam and Christianity, as being all, fruit of the poisonous tree, in a sense. So they want to get rid of all of it and replace it with paganism. And Himmler, of course, was very pagan. But accommodations had to be made, and the Pope represented a lot of people and a lot of power and a lot of money as well, and a lot of influence. So there were some accommodations being made, and the Pope was making accommodations as well. Pius XII at the time was making his own set of accommodations. And Pius XII, we have to look at his history. He was in Munich at the time of the beer hall putsch. Not the beer hall putsch, but in time at the end of World War I, when there was a putsch in place to try to put the communists in charge of Munich. We forget that at the end of World War I, Germany was in pieces, and it was in danger of becoming a communist state because of all the influence from the revolution in Russia.
Yeah.
So it was a workers' revolt against the masters, and since the Germans had lost the war, a lot of people were very unhappy with their own government, and they wanted to replace it with a socialist-style government. So Pius XII was there. He witnessed the fact that it came very close, that there was going to be a socialist government installed in Munich as well as in Berlin and all over Germany, that Germany would have gone communist. They would have had a German-style Russian Revolution in that country. And it was only with the active resistance of groups like the Thule Gesellschaft and some of the other Freikorps groups, the anti-communist, the white as opposed to the red military and paramilitary groups, that kept Germany from going communist, and specifically Munich, where Pius XII was sort of a papal nuncio in that region. So he had this background of seeing that communism was very dangerous, and that the fascists were able to protect the church against this encroaching communism. So now he's the Pope, and he's very well disposed towards trying to protect the Nazi regime against communism. With the fall of the Third Reich, he was afraid the Soviets, with their massive advance into Europe, would then threaten Italy, would threaten the church in general, because the communists were actually holding elections a few years later in Italy, and they were in a good position to take over the Italian government. If that had happened, of course, then the church is in danger again. So there was a lot of high-level intrigues involving the church and the Nazis. But on the lower level, we had a guy in Salzburg, Austria, which was where the Americans had their headquarters of their counterintelligence corps for the army. These were Nazi hunters at the time. And we had a Catholic Monsignor who was instrumental in creating the Ratline. Basically, he did single-handedly start the Ratline from Austria. He was a Catholic, but he was a Croatian. And the Croatians were rabidly pro-Nazi during the war. Croatia is what used to be Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
So they were rabidly pro-Nazi. The Bosnians were Muslim, and they were pro-Nazi. And then you had the Serbians, who were Orthodox. These were Greek Orthodox type. They were Serbian Orthodox. And they were anti-Catholic, and the Catholics were anti-Orthodox. And the Croatians were Catholics, and the Bosnians were Muslims, and the Serbians were Orthodox in general terms. So the Croatian Catholics became Hitler's puppet regime in the Balkans, responsible for a lot of atrocities, for setting up a concentration camp of their own, Jasenovac, which was run by, at one point, Franciscan priests. So you had a very strong Catholic Nazi presence in the Balkans. When the Balkans fell, the Croatian government now was in danger of being arrested and shot on sight by the communists. So this Monsignor, Krunoslav Draganovic, very important name in the story, managed to rescue virtually the entire Croatian puppet government and get them safely into Italy and from Italy into Argentina,
Oh.
where they lived out basically the rest of the peace. So that was the beginning of the Ratline, because with those credentials and with that network set up, he was able not only to help rescue the Croatians, his own fellow countrymen, he was able to rescue all of the Nazis who came to him. And we're talking some of the biggest names in the business. We're talking about Josef Mengele. We're talking about Klaus Barbie, Franz Frankl. We're talking about all of these, concentration camp commanders and sadistic doctors and SS officers and butchers. I mean, the whole list, it's endless, of the people that he managed to help escape. And it was called the monastery route. And it was called that because he would move the Nazis out of Austria through Italy using various church covers. So you would wind up at a monastery or at a church somewhere, and you would be protected there and moved on to the next monastery or the next church until you got all the way to Rome, and from Rome to Genoa, which was a seaport. And in Genoa, you waited for your fake papers, your false passports, your false identity papers, that got you onto a ship bound for Argentina, and that was the route that they used. And Draganovic was the guy in charge of that route. He was the guy who created it single-handedly, and then eventually wound up working as an agent for the CIA. When the CIA was founded after 1947, suddenly you find Draganovic becoming instrumental in helping the CIA in their counter-Soviet activities. So it's a very incestuous little group of people. Intelligence, American intelligence, you've got the Nazis, you've got the Croatians, you have the Catholic Church, you've got the Argentines, you've got an elaborate network, a support system, and a lot of it financed by people like Otto Skorzeny and Hans Ulrich Rudel. These were commanders in Hitler's armed forces who had the access to the money that the SS had been stealing constantly since the war started, stealing it, of course, beginning with stealing it from Jews, from communists, from stealing art, from museums and private collections, stealing gold, stealing money wherever they found it. A lot of it winding up in Switzerland, as we know, in Swiss banks, but still a lot more of it winding up exactly in Austria, in the Salzburg region, where the Ratlines began. Money that was buried in the salt mines in and around Salzburg. The name Salzburg means the city of salt. That's where all the salt mines were located, and these were great places to hide treasure. And a lot of treasure was buried there, and not all of it has been recovered. So some of the holy relics that Hitler had stolen, were buried all over Austria, Germany, and in the salt mines. So it's it's an interesting story, but it's a very complicated one because there's so many agendas.
Well, who was Sarek?
Saric was that's one of the names of the Croatians who was involved in the Ratlines, and Saric was one of the guys who was rescued by Draganovic. Again, we're talking about people who were helping to run the pogroms against the Jews and against the Orthodox. People who were really heavily involved with the Church's attempt to forcibly convert the Serbian Orthodox to Catholicism. So you had clergymen, of the rank, people like Stepinac and the others around Stepinac, who were actively involved in forcibly converting the Orthodox, and in some cases putting the Orthodox in concentration camps. And in some cases, it's been reported that after the Orthodox had been forcibly converted to Catholicism, they were then executed. So had this horrible situation going on. You had Pavelic, who was the president or the head of the Croatian government, and then you had a whole bunch of his ministers, then you had a whole bunch of clergymen, and they were all publishing stories about, how the Jews were an inferior race, how killing the Jews is not a problem, it's not a sin, how these were, the children of Satan, and on and on and on. And the problem to me is that you have an archbishop like Stepinac who's been beatified by Pope John Paul II. And Stepinac, we know, was helping the Croatian fascist regime. I mean, he was helping hide their money. He was helping, in some cases, hide their people. And yet, they're going to make him a saint in the Catholic. I think that, it's a questionable choice.
Yes.
So you can say that from the Church's point of view, he was heroic because he stood up to communism. But the dark end of Stepinac, the dark side, is the help that he gave to people like Pavelić and Saric and everybody else. So, it's very troublesome who was born and raised a Catholic to look at, the number of Catholic clergymen who were involved in this operation, and all the way over, of course, to Bishop Hudal, even Cardinal Tisserand, and some of the other high-ranking Catholic clergymen, some of them openly pro-Nazi, openly pro-fascist, and who were helping, all of these people to escape willingly and joyfully, So you had Hudal, an Austrian bishop, very prominent Austrian bishop, who wrote a book in praise of National Socialism, which was inscribed to Hitler. There's a copy that, was autographed by Hudal for Hitler. I mean, these guys were nuts, but they saw that Hitler represented the best defense that they had against communism, which in those days was considered a massive, massive threat. I mean, we remember the Cold War.
Yes.
The Soviet Union was portrayed as the evil empire and all of this. I mean, there was no fooling around. And at the end of World War II, that was especially, the case. George Patton, General Patton, famously said that during the war they had pointed their guns in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
To invade.
You're breaking up.
Oh, sorry. Is it okay now?
Yes. Peter?
Can you hear me?
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay. So you had this problem of the Church being pro-fascist and pro-Nazi, and we have to get past that. We have to accept that was the case. There's been a lot of revisionist history trying to portray the Church as heroically standing up to the Nazis, and individual bishops did, but that was not the official agenda,
Right.
When you archbishops and bishops, for instance, in Croatia, writing articles praising the Nazis, what is a lay person going to church supposed to think?
Yeah.
Right? The Pope is silent during the war about his opposition to Nazism or fascism. He's really opposed to it. He's quiet. And yet his subordinates are out there praising the Nazis.
Well,
so if you're a person going to Mass on Sunday and you hear these speeches, what are you supposed to think? You believe that that's the Church's official policy. You have to believe that. So now trying to write stories that the Pope didn't know, or the Pope was trying to cut a different deal, or the Pope was secretly helping the Jews. In those days, secretly helping didn't matter much when your faithful thought that your position was pro-Nazi.
Yeah.
So, it just encouraged your faithful to help support the fascists and the Nazis, which is what they did. I mean, in Germany in particular, there was no real viable opposition to the Nazis among the Catholic laity. So why would they? There was the deal that was cut between Pius and the Nazis. So it was the Concordat, which basically told the Germans, we're not going to get involved in German Catholic stuff. We're going to stay out of it, which basically gave the Catholic in Germany right over to the Nazis and said, you guys are on your own. So, the Church's involvement in this is a very important part of World War II history, and there's, passionate people on both sides of that issue, trying to either whitewash it or trying to make it seem worse than it was. But the reality is, it was pretty bad.
Yeah.
Pro-Catholic elements in Latin America were all anti-communist, pro-Catholic, and they eventually became very sympathetic to the Nazi cause. I mean, South America was very slow in declaring war against Germany. I mean, they didn't do it in many cases until just before the war, when they saw the war was over anyway. So Argentina would declare war against Germany, weeks before the end of the war, and Chile would do the same thing. I mean, it was stupid. So Mexico, another story. A very strong Nazi party in Mexico, very strong in Venezuela, a strong party in Colombia. So you had these groups that, in some cases, the Nazi parties there went back to the 1920s and the early 1930s. So there was a strong element there, Catholic Latin America, very anti-communist, very pro-Nazi. That was the environment that you were dealing with.
For the younger audience that may not know about the Ustaše, can you enlighten the listeners about the Ustaše?
The Ustaše was the Nazi party of Croatia. The Ustaše were the defenders of the faith. They consider themselves the defenders of Catholicism in the Balkans. They consider themselves, of course, the ultimate anti-communist organization. So they were a puppet government of the Third Reich. They saw themselves as Aryans. Now, this is a delicate situation. Official German doctrine at that time considered all Slavs, all Slavic peoples, to be second-class citizens. They were not Aryans. They were only useful for manual labor, for working in road construction and building construction and that sort of thing. So they would never be admitted to the inner sanctums. And when their usefulness was over, they would have been exterminated just like everyone else. So the Ustaše went to great lengths to prove that they were not Slavs. They went to all sorts of contortions to try to prove that they were really descendants of an Aryan tribe that wound up, sort of accidentally in the Balkans. So they were kind of grudgingly given acceptance there, which is similar to the situation of the Bosnians. The Bosnians were also Slavs by any stretch of the imagination, but because they were largely Muslim, and because there was Muslim elements that were pro-Nazi at the time, the Bosnians were tolerated as well. And there was a Bosnian SS division called the Hanshar, or the Mountain Division of the SS, that had been created by a Palestinian Arab, al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who was a rabid anti-colonialist, basically. He saw that Palestine had been, and the Arab cause in general, had been betrayed after the end of World War I, when the British and the carved up the Middle East between them. So that's a long story. That goes back to World War I. It goes back to enlisting Arab support for the British fight against the Turks, because the Turks were allies of the Germans in World War I. So the British made certain promises to the Arabs that they would get their independence, that they would get their freedom, that they would have self-determination. And, of course, that didn't really happen. At the end of World War I, the British and the French carved up the entire region. They decided spheres of influence. They fought over oil rights, that sort of thing. So the people who got really screwed in the middle of all of that were the Palestinians, because suddenly they found out that a chunk of their land was going to go to a new state called Israel.
Yes.
No one had asked them. There had been letters going back and forth, correspondence. Promises had been made to the Arabs regarding this proposed homeland. It looked as though there was going to be no problem, but then when the dust had settled, the British mandate changed all of that. So there's a lot of issues there, a lot of issues. And people today assume that, the Muslims are anti-Western, and they hate, the West. They have to realize it goes back to that time. It goes back to World War I. It goes back to promises that were made and not kept, kind of similar to how promises were made to the Native Americans and not kept, and how Native Americans were shuffled off into reservations. We basically had, reservations being set up in the Middle East. And, you guys could go here, and you guys had to go there, and this is a border, you can't cross it. All of this was being done, and there's a lot of real bad feelings because of that. So, going back to your initial question of the Ustaše, these people came out of this background. There was, World War I was the collapse of the Hungarian Empire. A lot of countries suddenly found themselves being by the victorious Allies. You had a country formed called Czechoslovakia, which had never existed before.
Yeah.
Artificial creation. The Czechs are the same people, but they don't have the same culture. They don't have the same language. Largely, they don't have the same religion. And yet they were a country. It was a very uncomfortable since the beginning. And, of course, it's fallen apart again. There's the Slovak Republic and the Czech Republic. The same thing with Yugoslavia. Suddenly you had a bunch of countries forced together. You had Serbo-Croatia, which itself was kind of a miscarriage. You had the Bosnians, part of that. You had all of these little countries being forced into one big country. All of that's falling apart. And suddenly, you have the Ustaše coming into their being, and these are nationalists. They're saying we're Croatians and we have a strong and proud history, and we're not Slavs like the other you guys. We're Catholics and Aryans, and we're going to kick communist ass, the Catholics as well, and the Orthodox as well, because the Orthodox are inferior and they're not true believers, and they're our enemies too. So it was an absolute mess. The Ustaše had their own goals. They set up their own concentration camps, as I mentioned.
They committed horrific tortures.
Absolutely, sure. They were Nazis. They were Nazis in everything except name. They were called Ustaše, but they were pro-Nazi. There was the Nazi puppet regime. So their concentration camp, Jasenovac in Croatia, was notorious. And as I say, run by, at one point, Franciscan priests. Franciscan priest in charge of a concentration camp where people are being murdered. And this was considered right. This was.
Peter, your voice is going in and out. Hold on. Okay, sorry for the interruption, everybody, but the recording was not going very well. So go ahead.
Right. So, as I said, Catholic priests in charge of concentration camps, and they thought that was the right thing to do, which was, why wouldn't they? I mean, they saw themselves as crusaders, to use a very, loaded term. They saw themselves as fighting another crusade, and this time in cooperation, oddly enough, with the Muslims of the region. So you had the Bosnian Muslims who were just as pro-Nazi as the Ustaše Catholics. So they were making common cause against the Orthodox, against the communists. It was bizarre, really bizarre. But, war does make strange bedfellows, and that's, what was going on. You had people who ordinarily wouldn't talk to each other are now cooperating with each other because they have a common enemy. And, of course, let's not forget, one of the common enemies was the Jews. So the Bosnians and the Ustaše both despised the Jews as much as they despised communism. And to their point of view, they saw communists, as the communism in general, as a Jewish creation. They go back again to Karl Marx having been Jewish, although he repudiated his Judaism, hated his Judaism, wrote against it, wrote about the Jewish problem, and that didn't matter to the Nazis and to the Ustaše and to the Catholics. Communism was a Jewish phenomenon, and this is what happens when the Jews get control of a country, and they turn communist. So this was their attitude. So to go against the Jews and go against the communists was basically the same thing.
Well, Peter, what about the camps? There's a lot of New Age type literature out that the camps were nothing. I mean, they're totally discounting the camps. Well, yeah, there's a lot of Holocaust denial out there where this is concerned, and I find it the arguments are really specious. I mean, we have, the standard argument these days that I hear a lot is these were not extermination camps. These were not death camps. That the Jews who died in these camps died because of disease. They died because of typhus.
They died because of starvation, et cetera, as if that was okay.
Yeah.
I mean, they would not have had typhus had they not been sent to these camps, forced into these squalid conditions, packed in like sardines, and worked to death. I mean, how can you say that they didn't kill them, that they died of natural causes, right? I mean, it's ridiculous, but that's the argument. The argument now is, the new argument is, well, they died mostly of disease. They were not actually killed. I mean, what were they doing in the camps in the first place?
Right.
That's the first argument, and the second argument against the people are trying to say the Holocaust was not directed at the Jews in particular, on and on, that there was no attempt to exterminate the Jews, is of course faintly ridiculous if you look at the record. In my book, I talk about, for instance, in Ratline, a very famous German SS officer, Walter Rauff. Now, Walter Rauff is credited with having invented the mobile gas van. This is the beginning of the cremation, the gas chamber concept, before they actually built chambers, fixed building. What Rauff did was he would put the Jewish prisoners in the back of a regular van, a panel truck, close the door, and then pipe the exhaust from the truck into the back of the van, and then you drive around until everybody's dead.
They did this also with disabled children.
Sure.
They sent letters to parents who had put their children in institutions stating that they had expired, etc., and all the while putting these children in these vans and doing exactly what you said, piping the exhaust into the van. And I think anybody that wants to know about, in detail about this, should read The Nazi Doctors by Robert J. Lifton.
Right. It's a very good resource.
Yes.
And to look at some of the reasonings that existed behind this, a good companion volume is The Master Plan by Heather Pringle, where she talks about the Ahnenerbe, the SS occult division, in very good detail, and shows some of the mystical concepts that went behind some of this stuff. The ideology that motivated these things. So you can read Lifton on one side and Pringle on the other. You get a very good idea of what went on and why it happened. So you have Walter Rauff, and I forgot what I was going to talk about Rauff. Oh, yes. One of Walter Rauff, the SS guy who invented this mobile gas van, one of his specialties was going into occupied territories that the Nazis had just conquered and looking for Jews to put into camps. I mean, this was something that this was his thing. So when the Africa Corps, the Nazi army, was in North Africa, moving through the North African countries one by one, Walter Rauff would follow. He would follow Rommel's march, and every time a city or a town was captured, Rauff would go in there looking for the Jews to arrest. I mean, this was an active campaign to find them wherever they happened to be. It wasn't just getting rid of Jews in Germany. It wasn't just getting rid of Jews in Eastern Europe. I mean, this was anywhere in the world they could be found.
It was. They were hunting them.
They were hunting them. And as I point out in Ratline, they went as far as Asia to find Jews to put into camps.
Okay.
I mean, they went all the way to Southeast Asia to find Jews. When the Japanese had conquered a territory, then you had the Gestapo going into that conquered territory looking for Jews to put into camps. I mean, 10,000 miles away, where they were at no threat at all, right, to the German culture, they were going to go out there and put them into camps. So, anybody who says that there was no concerted effort to persecute Jews or to kill them or exterminate them just has to look at the record.
Yeah, that's right. But I'm afraid a lot of them do look at the record and then they try to figure out ways around it,
Sure.
There was a lot of suffering inhumane treatment. People were starved to death. Oh my God!
I mean, if that happened in the United States today, right? If we had isolated a group of people this way and stuck them into camps, and they got sick and died, who would not call that a Holocaust? I mean, it boggles the mind that for people to actually go and try to defend this by saying, well, it was not quite 6 million, it was probably only 1 million or 2 million, or 3 million, and they weren't really, murdered. They simply died of total neglect and disease because we just sat there and pushed them into, darkened little dormitories and let them sit there. And
places.
I mean, come on, let's
even if it's 100,000 people, Peter, that's too many.
Of course,
Yeah. And also, in one of the camps had a officers' barracks attached to it, and they used to hold parties where they invited the children, and most of those children were raped and sodomized.
Well, when you have people who are basically sadistic, in charge of human beings who have no power whatsoever, you're setting up a dynamic, and some people, whatever sadomasochistic tendencies they had would find suddenly a channel and an outlet that they didn't even know. I mean, suddenly they're in total control of an entire population. And this is what you have to expect. This is why this is so wrong. This is why this is so evil. Lifton, since you mentioned him, talks about doubling. He says that these were people who then went home to their wives and their families and celebrated Christmas around a Christmas tree, and at the same time were supervising, were supervising massacres.
Yes.
Mass murder. How can you do that? I mean, as a human being, how do you do that? And Lifton said, well, the only explanation is something that he calls doubling, that you basically develop another personality that exists in that context of the gas chambers, of the crematoria, of the death camps and the concentration camps, and that's your other personality. And then when you leave the camp, the other, your first personality takes over, and you become the loving father and all the rest of it. The psychotic, I mean, it's a laboratory for creating psychosis.
Psychopaths.
On both sides. I mean, the trauma that a child will experience under those circumstances will lead them to become dissociated, to develop dissociative identity disorder, to perhaps turn into some kind of serial killer, because of the abuse and the trauma. I mean, the greatest fictitious, example of this, of course, is Hannibal Lecter. His backstory is that he was, he suffered during World War II, and saw the rape of his and death of his sister, and this is what set him on this path of becoming a serial killer. That's a fictitious story, but it's a good way of illustrating, what psychologists and psychiatrists now believe happens to the severely traumatized child. So you have the formula for creating psychosis on both sides of that equation, and that's what's so horrible about this entire episode of human history. And we should be using that as a laboratory ourselves to understand violence and to understand sadomasochism, to understand the abuses of power, to understand the erotic components of power, which is something that we don't really like to look at, but it's definitely there. I mean, there was a famous film years ago called The Night Porter, which talks about that to some extent. And, there is a kind of consciousness of this, but it's not really talked about. It's not really, examined thoroughly, but it's something that exists. There is, an erotic component to power. So the human psyche is very vulnerable to these suggestions, I think, and you create monsters in the process.
Well, look at Obama with his kill list. Look at Syria. My God. Look at Libya. And now it's spilling over into, I can't think of the name of the country, but it's what's going on in Syria is spreading to other countries. Lebanon.
Right. Well, again, that's a really complicated part of the world. I mean, it gets away from our topic a little bit, but Syria, the Assad regime is a very strange regime in the first place. I mean, it's to some Muslims, they're not quite Muslim, you know.
Yeah.
They're Alawis, and the Alawi heritage is very strange. They're not normative Muslims by any means. They have a lot of very mystical tendencies, and there's mixtures of Christian ideas and Gnostic ideas and everything else mixed in. So that's another whole kettle of fish. And then they're considered more Shia than Sunni, which means that they're natural allies in some cases with Iran, which means that they're natural allies with Hezbollah, and we go back to Lebanon and we go back to Palestine and, you know, all of those issues. So you have the Druze in Lebanon who are not normative Muslim either, you know. So people tend to think of Islam as this kind of monolithic religion where everybody marches in lockstep and they all believe the same thing, and it's not true. Part of the reason for that regional conflicts are religious, and they go back to tribal conflict but also to religious conflicts. There's a lot of religious diversity in the region, not just between Jews and Christians and Muslims, but in between the Muslim denominations themselves. I mean, are Druze really Muslim? That's not, you know, that's pretty much debatable. Alawis also, are they really Muslim? That's debatable. The Kurds, you know, the Yazidi, for instance, are not Muslim by any stretch of the imagination either. So you have a lot of groups that, you know, are natural enemies there too. So it's the Balkanization of the Middle East that you're looking at. You know, you're looking at fracturing that region into a lot of separate, smaller countries that will start fighting each other probably. So we'll have to wait and see on that one.
Well, I get very upset, Peter, when I see emails in my email box. Oh, the Muslims did this, the Muslims did that. And they're not defining what group. Like the Wahhabi, the Salafists are very violence-oriented, you know, and it's like lumping all Christians in one under one umbrella. We just can't do that.
Well, no, but it's again, it's easy for the other side to do the same. So, you know, the other side will lump all Christians together. So Catholics, Protestants, you know, every kind of Protestant, from Lutheran to Baptist to Methodist to Presbyterian, they're all the same in the eyes of the other. So, and they would not consider themselves the same, you know.
Yeah.
And the Protestants, you know, really look down on the Catholics as being superstitious pagans. So you have quite a mix. Then you have Mormons, and God knows where they belong.
Yeah.
In that, I mean, you know, so it's you know, you've got. It's just too easy to scapegoat this way. I mean, it's a substitute for thinking. I mean, symbols are always substitutes for thinking. You know, names are substitutes for thinking. People don't want to think that much. It's too hard. It hurts the brain to try to keep all those things, you know, straight. So it's just easier to lump them all together and say all Muslims are like this, you know, and all Jews are like that. I mean, lumping all the Jews together is a big mistake.
Yes.
You know, there are a lot of very, very Orthodox Jews who are anti-Zionist, you know, and who are critical of Israel. I mean, but nobody talks about that. So
well, there's a lot of Israelis that have demonstrated in the streets against Israel bombing Iran. There are a lot of Israelis who have signed a petition to Bibi not to bomb Iran. My God. You know, does any leader anywhere listen to the people?
Well, from a leadership point of view, that's probably counterproductive. If you listen to people, you're not going to get your agenda through. You know. Well, you know, that's what the allure in countries like Latin America, in areas like Latin America and regions like Africa and Asia, the allure of communism was that this was, government from the people, right? It was the workers' paradise. It was the dictatorship of the proletariat. And people believed that, and they thought it was a wonderful dream, and you could realize that and kick out the fat cats and the oligarchs and the people in charge of corporations and all of this. And in the end, what happened, right? In the end, governments were formed anyway.
Yeah.
And governments started dictating to their own people anyway. It just didn't happen the way Marx promised it would.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't. Power is different from systems. Power is power. Power is a naked force. And when someone gets into a position of power, all those nice dreams go out the window. Look at the Catholic Church.
Yes.
What relationship does the College of Cardinals have to the original message of Jesus? What relationship is there? There isn't any. So we can't, we want to attack government for not being responsive to people, but the church, one of the largest institutions in the world, over 1 billion, Christians, Catholics, who hold up the church as this, who hold allegiance to the Pope, they're holding allegiance to a government again, to something that's trying to consolidate and hold on to its own power. The deals that Pius made, with the Nazis and the silence that he kept was to keep the church together, was to keep the Vatican from being invaded. You betrayed your ideals, you betrayed your faith in favor of a physical institution, in favor of a government, basically. That's what was taking place, and people find it very hard, to separate the two and to say government is not worth it. The people are worth it. The people are where the power should be invested. We should be caring about them and not about maintaining this superficial entity that we created.
Yes.
Called the government. We should be able to change that any time, as our founding fathers said. A revolution every once in a while is a good thing.
Yeah, well, the Catholic Church has the Vatican has what amounts to an embassy in every country of the world.
Sure.
They have got an intelligence apparatus that rivals the Mossad. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Sure. And maybe that's good for the point of view of keeping the institution of the church secure or safe or powerful. But in the end, what does that do for the lay person, the average person going to church? What does that do for them? What benefit are they getting out of all of that?
Right.
They have an authority telling them, what to believe, how to believe it. Okay, that's fine, I suppose, if you're trying to maintain some kind of doctrinal purity. But what benefit is the average person getting from the Vatican? And from all of this stuff. The church had to cut deals with Nazis to protect it from the communists. That's a deal with the devil.
Yeah.
And we made that deal with the devil in the post-war period with Operation Paperclip and with protecting war criminals and helping facilitate the Ratlines into Latin America. We cut the same deal with the devil. At a certain point, you have to ask yourself, does the end always justify the means? You have to ask yourself.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's very good. Oh, my gosh. Peter, this book, Ratline, is monumental. Oh, my goodness. It's a really good book with lots of photographs. Everybody get a copy of Ratline. And before we go, Peter, can you tell us more about the camps in Asia that the Jews were put into?
Well, I can give you one really famous example of a concentration camp inmate who was in a camp in Indonesia.
Okay.
And that's Xaviera Hollander.
Oh.
If anybody remembers Xaviera Hollander, she was the happy hooker of the 1970s, I believe. She wrote her autobiography. And she was one of those who wound up she was born and raised in Indonesia, and was put into a camp by the Nazis in Indonesia on the other side of the world. So the Japanese had invaded the country, and the Nazis showed up quite quickly, the Gestapo did, and they asked the Japanese, well, what are you doing about the Jews? And the Japanese said, what do you mean? You know, and the Gestapo said, well, we have to identify the Jews and put them into camps and isolate them from the rest of the population so we know what we're going to do with them. And the Japanese response was, well, you know, we're at war with countries, not with races.
Yeah.
And the Gestapo said, well, we're at war with races, so get out of the way. So they were supposedly allies, the Nazis and the Japanese. So the Japanese said, okay, you know, do what you want. And they went through and they created a number of small camps. There were not that many Jews in Indonesia, as you might imagine, but there were enough. There were enough to put into camps. There were hundreds, I think, perhaps thousands, that went into these camps during the war. Some died in the camps. Men and women were, as they were in Germany, were segregated into different camps. So you had women and children in one camp. You had men in another camp. And Xavier Hollander grew up, you know, under those circumstances and experienced that firsthand. So she was a Dutch national also. The Dutch were also considered enemy aliens because Germany had invaded Holland. But of course they didn't put all the Dutch in camps. What they did is they put Dutch Jews in camps.
Yeah.
The Dutch government pretty much collaborated with the Nazis almost wholeheartedly, as we are now realizing. So just being Dutch was not enough to get you arrested necessarily. To the Japanese, yes, but to the Germans, not necessarily. But they really wanted the Dutch Jews put in the camps. And that's what was taking place. So for the Germans to go all the way there, to get into a U-boat, you know, and travel all the way, I mean, under dangerous circumstances during wartime, through territory that was occupied by the British had India at the time. So you're traveling through the Indian Ocean, you're in danger of being torpedoed, you're in danger of being depth-charged, of being attacked, of being killed, and you're going all the way to a country on the other side of the world to make sure that Jews are taken care of. Don't tell me there was not a Nazi program of genocide against the Jews. You know, it's impossible to believe why they would have done all of that and risked so much, you know, and not entrust the Japanese to do it themselves, but they had to be on site to do it, you know.
What was their objection to the Jews in the first place?
Well, I mean, that's enshrined in Mein Kampf, Hitler's autobiography, which brings us to another story. We don't have time, but Hitler wrote Mein Kampf in jail after he had attempted the beer hall putsch in Munich in 1923. So he's in jail, and one of the people in jail with him is a very young man called Walter Havel. And Walter Havel marched, you know, with Himmler and with Hitler during that putsch. He was one of the people, you know, holding up the banners to try to take over Germany for the Nazi Party at that time. The putsch failed miserably. Hitler was arrested, thrown into jail. And he was thrown into jail with this guy, Walter Havel.
Too bad they didn't keep Hitler in jail.
Oh, yeah. He was supposed to. I mean, he was arrested for treason. In other circumstances, he might have been executed, but he had a lot of, you know, popular support, so they weren't able to do that. But Havel, then after about a year or so, gets out of prison. He goes to England for about a year, and then from there he goes to, of all places, Indonesia. And while in Indonesia, he sets up Nazi parties. He lives in that country for 10 years, and he sets up Nazi parties in every major city. I mean, this was a famous friend, practically a boyhood friend of Hitler, not boyhood of Hitler's, but his boyhood. He was an adolescent at the time of the beer hall putsch. Comes back, gets a nice cushy job with the Nazi equivalent of the State Department, and pretty much does nothing except hang out with Hitler until the final days in the bunker. I mean, Havel left the bunker after Hitler's alleged suicide. So he was one of the longest friends, the oldest friends of Hitler. And Hitler's opinion about the Jews was probably formed at an early age, but really takes off during his time spent in Vienna as a poverty-stricken homeless guy who was reading all sorts of occult literature and racist literature that portrayed the Jews as these mongrels and these monsters who were diluting pure German culture and diluting German blood and all of this. So he began to see that if he could rally the German people against this insidious enemy, that he would be able to gain power in the country. But it wasn't enough to do that. Hitler eventually came to believe in his own rhetoric. He came to believe in his own ideology and believed that the Jews represented this sick race, this virus in Europe that had to be eradicated at all costs. And the Holocaust continued at all costs. The Holocaust was a costly enterprise. It wasted time, resources, personnel, raw material, everything. It was a major drain on the German economy to do this. The only way they could get their money back was by seizing Jewish assets. And even that wasn't enough. It wasn't enough for the war effort, and yet they kept the camps running until the very end. That shows that their ideology was stronger than even their desire to win the war. So Hitler's beliefs were formed by basically occult ideas about the spiritual nature of different races and of how the Aryan race, the German race, was spiritually superior to that of the Jewish race, which was inferior. And I have to say, I'm sorry to any theosophists listening who take violent disagreement with me on this, but if you look at Blavatsky's writings, she is very condescending, which is a euphemistic word, towards the Jews.
Yes.
She tended to think that the Afghans were the real lost tribes of Israel, that the Afghanis were the actual Jews. And, there is a body of, crank literature that tends to support this, that the Afghans are actually Jews. And, there's some Jewish names among the Afghans, and they use that to lend support to this idea. But, she's tended to think that the Afghans were superior to the Jews that she came across. So, there's a bit of that in there, but her idea of races and racial superiority influenced a lot of thinkers around the turn of the century who wanted to translate Blavatsky's ideas into real racial eugenics, real racial theories about genetics and race and spirituality. It all got mixed up in there somehow. So it became a blood issue. And the SS had very strict regulations against sexual intercourse, for instance, with Jews, because that would pollute the German blood. Not only because of the children they would produce, but because the German man would become spiritually polluted. His spiritual nature would be diluted by proximity with Jewish women. So,
oh my gosh.
So this is all part of this major ideological agenda that the Nazis had. This was very much part of who they were and what they believed. Very important to Hitler. It's all over Mein Kampf. You can read it in Mein Kampf, his hatred of the Jews, his contempt, his disgust at the very physical image, the very physical presence of Jews, is visceral to Hitler by that time, by the time he's in prison. I think he sees Jews as having betrayed him, as having betrayed the German people. So this was part of it. This was part of his rage against the defeat of Germany in World War I was directed against Jews.
Well, Germany recently arrested a couple of dozen neo-Nazis. People seem to be trying to rally that Nazi-esque period once again in Germany.
Well, it's never gone away. I mean, it's still there.
Yeah.
And with the influx of Germans from East Germany, sort of, drinking at the fountain of the Western neo-Nazis, you're getting this backlash against the Muslim population coming into Europe,
yeah,
which is a rallying point to neo-Nazis. It was the Jews before, and now it's the Muslims, and in general, Eastern peoples from Turkey or from wherever, no matter what religion they are. So the racism is coming back again.
Yes.
Germany is struggling to maintain its economic superiority in Europe, and the neo-Nazis are fueling some of the anxieties concerning foreigners coming in and ruining it for everybody. So you have these ideas, and the Nazis are taking advantage of it. There are fascist parties in Germany that will gain strength if Germany starts to become weakened by the economic crisis. You're going to see the rise of fascism again there. I'm fairly positive, and they're going to scapegoat not only Jews, they're going to scapegoat Muslims because of it.
Yes, there's been a lot of that already, and quite a few arrests of Salafists that have a very strict interpretation of the Quran and other writings. I mean, ridiculous.
Well, they're not making it any easier. They're not making it any easier for their own people, obviously.
Right.
They are making it more difficult. They are basically setting up, a line in the sand, and they're creating this conflict where there should not be this conflict. They're making it almost impossible for their brothers and sisters in the faith to live normal lives, because they're trying to say that this is, this is who we are, and challenging and provoking this controversy. It's almost suicidal, but it's.
Well, Peter, this open door immigration policy started in Europe and in America about the same time.
Right.
And it's not helping anybody. Quite to the contrary. Well, I guess I better let you go. One other thing. In Tantric temples, you wrote, does Kabbalah and alchemy come from Asia?
I suggest that, certainly. Recent scholarship is tending to support this idea that there was a heavy influence from Asia. Alchemy, I would say, definitely has Asian roots. I can read now some Western alchemical texts in light of Asian alchemy and understand them easier than before. So I think that's definitely so, and I think Kabbalah also owes a great deal to tantric concepts of the Shekinah. Tantric concepts of Shiva and Shakti, and manifesting as Shekinah in Jewish mysticism. I think there's been a lot of research on that. I think Moshe Idel, one of the leading scholars, has told me, face to face when he was in Florida a few years ago, defending his point of view that the Zohar is basically a tantric text, and you have guys like Elliot Wolfson who are coming to that conclusion. Raphael Patai. These are all big names in Jewish history, Jewish mysticism, the history of Jewish religion, who are referencing Tantra and referencing Asian religion as having an influence over the development of Jewish mysticism. So I think we're safe. We're safe in that area of saying that there's, if not that it came directly from Asia, but that the Asian influence is very, very strong.
Well, what exactly is the definition of Tantra?
No one knows.
Oh, okay.
Everybody seems to have their own point of view on that, and everybody defines it differently. Tantra, to my way, has to deal. It's religious, it's spiritual, it's mystical, but it surrounds the central point of power, the idea of power, whether it's spiritual power, a political power, or magical power, let's say, the power to change events in accordance with your own will, to change reality. Tantra is about that. And so sexuality becomes involved with it because, sexuality is obviously a very powerful thing.
Yeah.
It creates human beings in the first place. So that's the creation of a child mimics, in the tantric view, the creation of the universe. So from the point of view of Tantra, there was a female goddess, a male god. They, in their cooperation, created the world as we know it, reality as we know it, through an act of divine intercourse that lasted millions of years maybe, but in the end created what we know now as reality. So tantricists or tantrikas, they tend to want to imitate that in some way, whether it's on a purely mental, spiritual way, through meditation, through yoga practices, through intensive study, concentration, and focus, or through ritual, whether the ritual actually involves sexuality or not. There's a lot of texts that we consider Tantra that give recipes, let's say, for this. They give ritual examples for how to do this, whether it's in physical form or mental or emotional states that you cultivate to get to that state of identification with this moment of creation. But Tantra is used as a mechanism for attaining power, for identifying with the creative power of the universe. I think the focus should be on that. Not in the West we have the focus on sex.
Yeah.
We think of as strictly as sex. But as I said at the very beginning, when we started talking this hour, eros and power are connected.
Oh, yes.
There's a erotic component to power. There's a power component to eros, to eroticism. And Tantra is about that connection. And I think if we shift our focus a little bit in that direction, we can better understand what Tantra might be.
And they can find that book, Tantric Temples, you also wrote, and it would be available at Amazon?
Sure.
Okay.
Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, all the usual sources.
Okay, and also Ratline, and also Unholy Alliance, Sinister Forces, a grimoire of American political witchcraft. That is a trilogy that was written by Peter Levenda, and it is fantastic. And so is Ratline, and I can't hardly wait until you get the book on Mormons out.
That's just coming out now, so you should be getting your copy soon. It's already in print.
Oh, my goodness. Wonderful. Well, we'll have some exciting interviews on that one.
Sure will.
Okay. Thank you very much, Peter, for your time and your information. And everybody, buy Peter Levenda's books. They are exquisitely researched, footnoted, and photographs, and you will come to really appreciate Peter Levenda's writings. So God bless everybody out there that's listening. Good night.